Hello, my name is Rebecca Chung, and I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Programs at UC Berkeley, as well as the Director of 21 CSLA. Thank you so much for attending Research Practice Webinar 8, Leaders Learning to Lead for Equity. Before we begin our webinar, we would like to start with the UC Berkeley Land Acknowledgement. 21 CSLA State Center is headquartered at UC Berkeley. Before we start this virtual meeting, we acknowledge that our university sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other Verona Band descendants. Every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. Furthermore, it is vitally important that we do not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand and work, but also we recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities. In recognition of this, members of the 21 CSLA State Center and Berkeley School of Education contribute to the Shumi Land Tax, a voluntary financial contribution that non-Indigenous people living on traditional Chochenyo and Ohlone territory make to support the critical work of the Sogorea Teo Land Trust. If you too have benefited or continue to benefit from the use and occupation of ancestral and unceded land, we encourage you to visit Native Land California to learn more about the land you occupy and find meaningful ways to support the Indigenous stewards of the land. Again, welcome to 21 CSLA's Research Practice Webinar number 8, Leaders Learning to Lead for Equity. 21 CSLA is dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders, teachers, site, and district to support more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. Headquartered at Berkeley Graduate School of Education, it is led in partnership with UCLA School of Education, the California Subject Matter Projects, and the 7 regional academies across the state. 21 CSLA is funded by 3 state agencies: the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, the California Department of Education, and the State Board of Education. The work of 21 CSLA is informed by an equity statement that reads, "Leaders for Equity transform education to improve access, opportunity, and inclusion for students and adults, especially those who are systemically marginalized and historically underserved, so that they can thrive." Today's webinar agenda will focus on hearing about research conducted within 21 CSLA activities that helps us better understand how to support leaders for equity in their professional learning. And then we'll include the voices of 2 21 CSLA participants who are also active leaders in California schools. They will share some of their experiences, and then we will take some questions from our participants. Feel free to write questions in the chat to me directly or to the overall chat, everyone in the chat, and I will be curating the questions in the chat for our guest panelists today. And then we'll close from some closing remarks from our featured researcher. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the 21 CSLA Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Aki Murata. Dr. Murata is best known for her research on mathematics, teaching and learning, as well as teacher development through lesson study. She has served as a professor at Stanford University, UC Berkeley, and the University of Florida. Dr. Murata is passionate about helping teachers improve instruction and facilitates collaboration-based teacher professional development globally, collaborating with educators at different career levels. Originally from Japan, Aki uses a cultural lens to analyze, examine, and understand U.S. teaching practices, helping teachers to investigate their own practices and also understanding how they're guided by their cultural beliefs. In her role as Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Murata conducts and guides research projects that inform the 21 CSLA initiative. Today marks our first webinar that highlights research conducted within 21 CSLA itself. Dr. Murata is translating her expertise in teacher development to the professional development of equity leaders. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Murata.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's always like listening to somebody introducing myself. Sounds like somebody else. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity to be able to share one of the research projects going on for 21 CSLA because we want to allow enough time for discussion. I would give like a short version of this research sharing today, but I would love to have continuing conversations about this later on. So please ask me questions here as well as later on by email. So today I'm talking about this research study that investigated how school leaders learn to lead for equity. And I think the question is why, right? So I mean, as school leaders, they have plenty of things to do. They have 100 decisions to make a day. They are fighting fire every day. And why do they want to lead for equity? My entering point for this angle is that before 21 CSLA, I've done a lot of like cross-cultural comparative studies, and I was always interested in, I am interested in how schools are structured and led culturally, and how teachers teach and kids learn according to the cultural framework. And study after study, those comparative studies, international studies, what we see is how in the United States, the gap between the highest achieving students and lowest achieving students, this is huge compared to other countries who may or may not be doing as well as we are. When we compare the average, their differences is this small. US one is this big. What that tells me and everybody is that our school system, our education is not serving everybody. It's serving the top students, but not the bottom students. So if we want to improve the society, we want to contribute, invest in the future, we have to lead for equity. We have to understand what is going on for the students who may not be as high achieving as the other countries. So transformative leadership is it's an idea framework that we want school leaders to lead transformatively. That comes from the idea that societal transformation cannot happen without changing education. It's that education itself is not going to change the society, but without changing the education, we are not going to change the society, right? So if we want to have more equitable society where the disparity between haves and have-nots are smaller, we have to work on education. So when school leaders start leading for lead transformatively, they start to question their own assumptions, because their assumptions likely came from the dominant society. And by questioning, they come to reveal injustice and non-democracy in society. Why does some school practices that work well in upper and middle class schools don't work as well in other communities? And so that helps disrupt inequitable practices, but all for envisioning better schooling for all of our children. So, but then when there's a transformative leaders, what does it look like in schools? So they do not blindly take in policy and practice decisions given. They might at the beginning, but then they come to learn that just taking it and implementing it is not, that does not help their students every time. So they become critical, critically question what each policy and practice means for their schools and students. And sometimes they create additional space so that the policy and practice can work for these schools and children. And the more I work with school leaders, the more I'm impressed how creatively they create the space for that. And so and then they continuously create access and opportunities for their students, because those opportunities are not provided otherwise. And this is a model of transformative leadership, comes from research literature. And again, like, I'm not going to get into this too deeply unless you want me to later on. But what I want to say is what the literature says, how the process starts with school leaders experiencing something in their schools that stops them, wonder, well, this is not working as well as I thought. And that leads them to critical reflection. And the literature says that reflection happens at two levels. The one is reflecting on their own beliefs. Another one is to reflecting on external factors where they have certain beliefs, what kind of outcomes that come from the belief. And then that will lead to transformative leadership actions. And I have some examples of this later on. So this particular study, the 12 California school leaders interviewed who participated in 21 CSLA community of practice earlier in 2021. So we interviewed twice, in the spring and in the fall. And because of COVID-19, we asked questions about pandemic challenges and how they are working with the challenges. But we also asked, go with that, how they learn to lead for equity, because the pandemic challenges revealed a lot of creative ideas that they work around the school policies and practices to help their students. And so for today, I want to focus on how what they told us about how they learn to lead for equity. So what we found is school leaders indicated that the shared experiences, challenges, visions, identities are very important when they sort out others who understand the situation's challenges, to create informal communities of support. Because school leaders, their lives, their situations, their challenges are very unique to themselves, that if they start speaking about this at the supermarket, the other people may not quite understand what's going on. So they had this common knowledge, common background helps. And those informal communities are where like they thrive and they learn, they feel supported and they learn together. And I'll talk more about this later on. And successful leaders have also, we found that multiple layers of communities and networks. That means some communities maybe, they may have a network with of people they did the credential program with, and then they have another community of people, they were assistant principal together, or another community of people they met at the conference, or some people outside of the district. So those effective leaders for equity, transformative leaders, we found that the more layers of different informal communities they have in their lives, they seem to be more adjusted and they're better adjusted, and then they were more motivated to keep going with their work. So I want to present a couple of case illustrations here, how that actually works in schools. But so here, transformative leadership, we are defining as, so transformative leadership happens when internal and external reflections happen that leads to leadership actions. So let me share a couple of cases. So Derek is a principal in one of the California, San Francisco Bay Area middle school, and he's been a principal there for 15 years. And he serves underserved, disadvantaged community too. And he reflected that he believes strongly that school leaders can make a difference by creating access. He's been successful. He feels good about creating accommodations for his communities. So when the partial school reopening happened about a year ago, and the district invited back students per their own rubric that excluded, according to Derek, highest need students. He reflected the outcome will be those students will be farther fall behind. So what the leadership action that came from that internal and external reflection together is when some parents declined to send their children back for the partial reopening, he reassigned the available slots to invite the highest need students that he knew. Again, this may go against the district policy. This may, and again, like this is a confidential sharing that they trusted me enough to share these stories with us. But this is one way that Derek created a space according to his internal and external reflections. And Miranda is a Latina principal of K6 school, K5 school in San Francisco Bay Area. And she's her voice is strong. That she chairs a diversity and social justice committee in the district, and she's very firm about leading for equity. And she's an instructional leader. She has a strong identity as an instructional leader, and supporting her teachers to teach well is one of her passions. And so when we were talking about COVID-19, she was sad that she just felt like she could not be a strong instructional leader during that time. And also, when severe teacher shortage was on our headline every day in fall 2021, right? There may be still going on the teacher shortages, but because that's the time when I talked to Miranda, her belief is that teachers need prep time to teach well. So even that severe teacher shortage is happening, she felt that demanding teachers to teach more classes will not lead to better teaching. So as a transformative leadership action, she decided not to require teachers to give up their prep at all, but instead dividing the class, moving students to other classrooms, and Miranda herself was subbing every day, all day too. So again, like this is the leadership decisions she made based on internal and external reflection. But I wanted to say this too, like it's not like those leaders are thinking like, okay, I made the internal reflection of this and external reflection of this, and this is the decision. That's not that at all. Of course, I mean, their decisions happen so seamlessly, and it's in the course of the day and their responsibilities and work, right? But it's my job. It's our job to make it clear what is going on, so that when we see like beginning principals or somebody who wants to support school leaders to lead for equity, we could kind of pay attention to these are the components of transformative leadership. So the role of informal professional community. So all the school leaders we interviewed said it was important in their lives. And there are 3 components to it. So one is definitely social and emotional support. They talked about, oh, I'm not alone. I feel understood. There's a sense of community there. And as I said before, that they don't have to explain what's going on. They automatically understand their situation, so that that support, social support being accepted, it's definitely there. But because of that, they also have intellectual and professional support because they feel safe, they are supported, they are together, they push each other to further transformative leadership practices and decisions. So like Derek's case, Miranda's case, they said that they have daily phone calls with their colleagues and their friends about the decisions they are making, so that they could kind of bounce ideas with. That seems to be very important, that they are not doing this alone, but they are pushing each other forward in this journey together. And because they are doing this together, they share the collective responsibilities, right? So United States, we are individual accountability culture, that we hold each other accountable. We point fingers and say, he's not doing this, she's doing this. But working together as a community, of course, they hold each other accountable, but they also have the collective responsibility, so they cannot fall behind when everybody else is doing the best they could. So when in the face of challenges as a community, they persevere together. That as I said earlier, they have, they may have 100 things to deal with a day, and when they have to make this one accommodation for equity, should we or should we not do it? But that shared collective responsibilities will put them in a space of ethical area, that they do the ethical work continuously, and then sense of belonging in a difficult process always helps. So I wanted to share a few feedback from the 21 CSLA community of practice participants, because that's important to me, that in their own words, how did they describe this? Ginny, she's a principal of K5 school down in San Jose. She said it was a grassroots work, and the people who were in control of the group was in the group. There was similar work in the district, but it was different. In this community of practice, she said, we purely focused on the issues that mattered. It was our time, it was our clock, chance to focus. And this community of practice was especially focused on reopening issues. So the principals came together and made plans for reopening processes. So Victor said, he's a middle school principal. I thought being able to work on things that we think are important rather than what the district thinks are important was helpful. Victor was not the only person who described the difference between informal community versus formal community that district created, that, and Ginny said this here too, right? They somehow felt that district-led PD was more about addressing district's agenda, but 21 CSLA community of practice was theirs, that they did their work, that what's important to them. And Tiffany lastly said, we have safe space where we could speak with like-minded people and also get perspective and know what's going to be heard and what's going to be allowed. We are going to think critically, having a platform and a place to really dive in. So I know that they took a lot out of participating in the community of practice with us. And so these are the things I'm learning through doing the research. But now I want to kind of switch the gear and hear from the panels, the school leaders who came to participate in this webinar for us about their experiences.
Thank you. Thank you for your summary comments, Dr. Murata, and for also conducting the research, giving us the overall. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our two practitioner panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Hannah Sufrin, who is assistant principal at Franklin Elementary School in Oakland Unified School District. She's also a graduate of the Principal Leadership Institute here at UC Berkeley. Prior to beginning her leadership journey, Hannah was a second, third, and fourth grade teacher in classrooms in New York City and also Oakland Unified. Second, it's my pleasure to introduce Abelardo Cordova, who is the principal of Herman Lineback Elementary School in the Elk Grove Unified School District. He's a native of Mexico and grew up most of his life in Milwaukee, Wisconsin before moving to California. He attended Marquette and Alverno and has served as a high school pre-college coordinator, internship coordinator, and has had many other roles at the middle school and elementary school level in his long career. His experience has been predominantly working with underprivileged and underrepresented communities. So thank you for joining us today during a very busy time of the year. We have a few questions for you to begin the discussion. And then as a reminder to participants, I will be monitoring the chat for any other additional questions you have for either our researcher, Dr. Murata, or our guests. So Abelardo and Hannah, tell us as a leader what your experiences have been for learning to lead for equity and how these 21 CSLA communities of practice, what your experience was in the community of practice structure.
Who do you want to go first?
Go ahead and get started.
Go ahead, Hannah. You want to go?
Okay, I'll go. Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca and Aki. I have to say first how humbled I am to have this opportunity to speak and share. I am very much at the beginning of my school leadership journey. I'm just 2 years into being an assistant principal in Oakland. And as Rebecca mentioned, finished my training at the Principal Leadership Institute in 2020. So this is all, the training piece is still very, very fresh for me. And the first thing I would say in response to that first question is that having had the opportunity to train at the Principal Leadership Institute was fundamentally the most important thing I did to become a leader for equity. I didn't have training as a teacher that felt like it was really the training that would make me the teacher I wanted to be. So then being able to do that as a principal and to be in a grad program that I knew every day I was in class was really training me to be a leader for equity was just phenomenal. And I will take that with me for my entire school leadership journey. And I'm just very deeply grateful for that. Everything about PLI felt equity centered. And so that led me to know that I could do everything that I do in this work with an equity centered mindset as well, having seen the way our professors and teachers and everyone involved in the program was centered in that way. There were a few pieces in particular that I would highlight from that. And one is learning how to do equity audits. So as soon as I went into my assistant principal work, understood that step one was figuring out what the equity audits were that would really help me to be an equity focused leader and to figure out where the equity gaps were in my particular new school. Another piece was community mapping. So especially having started school leadership at the height of COVID and in distance learning, community mapping was essential to figuring out what kind of leader I needed to be and what it meant to be a part of this community I was joining, and figuring out who the community partners were that were going to help us do this work for equity. And I've met and connected with so many amazing community partners that then became extremely central to our work as we transitioned to being in person the following year. And then a third piece there is that I took from PLI was just the power of all data. That the data on what we need to do to achieve equity for our students is not just in test scores, but it's in front of us and around us at all times, everywhere. And it's quantitative and it's qualitative, and it's about a lot more than just summative assessment. So those were three pieces that were essential to my jumping into school leadership from the beginning. And then I'll throw it over to Abelardo in a couple of minutes, but wanted to bring up two other things that have been really important as I start this journey. And one is, as Aki mentioned, figuring out who the people are for me to learn from. So as soon as I entered this role, I started to notice like, oh, this person in behavioral health seems to really know what it means to focus on social emotional learning. And this person in the newcomer support office seems to really know how we are going to support our newcomers, not in superficial ways, but really on the ground, making it happen. And so figuring out who those people were and how I could just present myself to them as the new leader who needed support and needed to learn and make clear what my goals were was really essential to not doing this work alone. And then the last piece I'll say in response to the first question is this has been a two-part journey, I think, from the beginning of figuring out what equity at my school site looks like, what we're trying to achieve for our students at the school site, and then also within the district. And so what it means on a day-to-day for there to be equity from student to student, class to class, grade to grade at Franklin was one thing. And that felt like a lot of listening and observing work. And then on the other hand, having gotten to participate in all of these leadership meetings at the district level, I started to see, even though I work at a district that claims to be so equity centered, I started to notice the moments where inequities were very much the elephant in the room and not discussed. And this was maybe naively very shocking to me at first. And that has been, on the flip side, not about listening, but figuring out what are the moments where I am speaking up and where, as Rebecca said, we are learning to critically question. And so building that confidence and that team of equally equity-minded folks who are in the room to stop inequity from being that elephant. So that feels like the flip side of, at my school site, I need a lot of listening, and at the district, maybe a little bit more speaking, because there is a lot that's unspoken. So that those have been really important skills to be training in. And then quickly on the second question, so as Rebecca mentioned, I got to participate in a community of practice with 21 CSLA, the one that Aki was describing. And it was a really significant experience for me because it was my first time as a new leader getting to just meet with really experienced principals from other districts. So I had gotten to connect with a lot of other leaders from my district, but getting to then connect with people who are just trying things out, especially during distance learning and the height of COVID, in so many different ways, was something that was really powerful. And specifically, having the opportunity to focus on an area that we felt was incredibly important for the return to school, and really stepping back and figuring out what was that area of focus. So my group chose how we were going to address students' social and emotional needs when we got back to school. This community of practice started before it seemed like anyone was going back in person. And we had several weeks of meeting where it was this theoretical, what will we do in a year conversation. And then strangely, over the course of that month, every district started going back. This was last spring. And the work that was so theoretical suddenly became what was happening next week. And we could have so easily just sunk into logistics and what are you doing about this challenge of these COVID practices? How are you handling arrival? How are you handling hand sanitizer? Because that's what was happening in every other space that I was a part of. And yet the group maintained focus on social and emotional needs of students. And that was incredibly powerful because everything else was about logistics. And this was the one time in my week where we weren't talking about hand sanitizer and we were talking about really what mattered about the return to school. And that became very central to how I prepared to bring kids back in person. So I'm incredibly grateful for that time and for Aki's leadership of that. And she was essential to really pushing us to focus on why we had come to the community of practice in the first place. Even though everything had shifted and we were suddenly going back to school in a moment of crisis, she very just gently and encouragingly got us to commit to not letting go of why we were there in the first place, which was much bigger goals than just the tomorrow stuff. So that was among the most important things that I did for coming back to school in person with an equity mindset. And with that, I will throw it over to Abelardo.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you to everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to just share some of my experiences around equity as a leader and what it means and how we go about it here at Herman Limbach Elementary. And when I think about equity, it's hard to have some of these conversations with people who are not as clear about what equity really means. They think of justice, they think of freedoms, they think about these images or things that are out there, and to really understand concretely what it means and how it applies to students, especially our families and communities that are underserved or need a voice. So pretty much it's about understanding the purpose, the why. Why are we here and what are we doing? We're here to educate our youth so that they can be productive citizens in our country and in the future. So if our challenge or if our work is to prepare students for college and career and life skills, how are we doing that? What are we doing about it? What is the mindset that we need to have in order to progress and assist all students? And so when the challenge again is defining equity, not giving everybody the same thing, but giving everybody what they need. I work in a school that is predominantly high poverty school, and coming out of the pandemic, this has been impactful very much to our students. They are still dealing with trauma. They're still trying to find places to live. It's very, very a big struggle in terms of rent and doing what they need to do. The majority of my students live in apartment complexes, so there's a lot of chaos around them. When they come to school, this is the norm. This is where we can set, a tone for them to let them know they're in a safe place, and we are here to help them learn, grow, and succeed. So with all that, we saw the gap with them coming in, and a lot of things that needed to be covered. And along with that, with equity is, we need to understand what our beliefs are, what our agreements and commitments will be as well. We're still struggling in some places around those things in terms of, hard work is the only thing that will make you successful. And when we're dealing with equity, it's not just hard work, it's opportunity, it's access, it's connections, it's being able to get to that place with the hard work that you're putting into place. So we have to understand that equity isn't just here at the schools, it's systemic overall. When we still have to talk about, firsts in many things, such as the first African-American justice, we have a long way to go as far as equity is concerned. But our role as educators is to help students understand that they can do it. We are here to help them, and we will work on everything we need to do to help every individual student. So just like we have differentiated instruction, everything has to be differentiated around equity, depending on what the needs are of your community. So because of the high needs that we have here at Hertman-Leinbach, SEL is not enough. SEL is just the top layer of how we can impact students. We need more than that. We need counseling. We need trauma-informed practices. We need to be able to reach parents and the community in a more impactful way. And so, when we look at the process, we got all these ESSER funds, and it's about spending the money on the students and getting them there. But there's some limitations around what we can do, because if we buy people, then they're contractual. And then we have to look at, how many years can we keep them? And if we can't keep them, we can't hire them. But that's what's going to help our students the most. The people who can work with our students academically and social emotionally, they are equipped to do that. What's hard is teachers who are asked to do the deep SEL pieces that they weren't trained to do. It's difficult work. It's impactful work. It can be done, but we have nowhere near trained people to do the SEL work around our district, around everywhere, and let alone in a community where there's such a great need for these kind of practices. So for me, equity is a very important topic. I always speak about it in my meetings and talk to the teachers and the staff about equity. I still get people who are confused about what equity means, because then they talk about their equity as an educator, and I have to stop them and say, no, this is not about you. It's about the students. It's about equity for them. When we talk about equity for you, this is a whole different conversation, but we're talking about equity for our students and how it impacts them, and what can we do every single day in the classrooms, in the culture, in the climate, in all the interactions that we have with our students, so they can leave understanding that they have support, but also the confidence to move forward. A lot of students don't have that confidence. Growing up as a first generation Mexican, you know, parents didn't speak English, not a lot of resources. We were poor. And I think the biggest thing was that I was lacking as a student in elementary school was confidence. I didn't believe in myself. I didn't understand a lot of the processes. I didn't understand a lot of the systems, and I didn't understand where I was going. Really, there was no conversation around that. It was just coming to school and doing the work. When we start helping design that conversations with our students and with our families around what we offer and how students can move from elementary school to middle school to high school to college, that's the framework that we can continuously talk about and give everybody that opportunity. And I still feel that sometimes people will say, not everybody needs to go to college. Not everybody is up, that's not for everyone. I don't accept that for my children, and they know that. So why should we have that understanding for other people's children? The opportunity, the access, whether they choose to go or not, needs to be there. Whether they choose a whole different thing based on their skill sets, enter college, whether it's community college or some other higher education type of system where they can pursue whatever they want to pursue. So we should not have the mindset of this, only a certain group of people should really go on this far or do these kind of things. The mindset is everyone, and what are we going to do to get there? Through our instruction, through our practices, through our professional learning communities, all of that. There's so many multi-layers to this. And the great thing about this conversation around equity, I really think this is the beginning of a lot of things to happen in the future around our practices, because it's not really as strong as it could be. And having these kind of dialogues, having these conversations is the first step. But it's not just the conversation, it's the action piece that needs to come into effect. We need to be just leaders of change always, and looking at how do we impact our students, and then how do we impact the educators on our campus. And it's not quick, it's not fast. We know that change in curriculum takes sometimes 2, 4, 6 years. And that's curriculum. That's when people buy into it, if they buy into it. We're still getting people to buy into this theme or theory or idea of equity. And what we do is sometimes we dialogue amongst ourselves because we believe in it, but we have to open the conversation. And whether it's uncomfortable or courageous or whatever we want to say around it, it's what needs to happen on behalf of all students. I hope that I also, in my answer, said some things about my experience with communities of practice. And I think one of the things that I was able to do in one of the sessions was that reflection piece, and working with other people that were in the course or in the conversation is just being able to reflect on some of the work that we're doing and some of the things that we're doing as well. That reflection piece is so critical around, are we on the right course? Are we doing the right things? How do we measure our success? One of the things I've been thinking about around equity is that reflection and measurement piece. So when teachers get together in their PLCs, the conversation isn't about, I did these SEL activities. It should be more about, how did I impact equity for our students, and what was my role in that? Part of it was, I hope I'm not trying to ramble here. The part of it is focusing on real critical things that impact empathy and equity. We started off the school year because I needed teachers to make connections with students and parents. We started off the school year on professional development on active listening, how to listen carefully to our students and to our parents. That's huge. And that's still a big thing for many of us, how to listen and understand. That whole piece drives straight to equity and understanding. So lots of work to do, lots of conversations, lots of actions. But I really thank everyone here for the opportunity. I thank everyone who has been just listening and has something to add to it, because all of us as a collaborative can really focus on the efficacy of what we're doing and hopefully bring us to different levels. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm making so many connections in my mind between the theories that Aki Murata raised and also your comments. And I'd like to just start us off with a few questions. One has to do with this point of listening that you brought up, Abelardo, and also Hannah brought up the issue of listening in her context as a leader. And I want to take it to the facilitation of the space, because many people who are in a part of this webinar today are the people who are providing the professional learning for leaders. And so we want to hear your input. What kind of facilitation helps to engender active listening inside the community of practice? How do we listen better? What other facilitation strategies are needed that we can learn from you?
Well, when I was looking at doing this at the beginning of the school year, and I was working with my team on presenting it, first of all, we thought, let's go big. And I said, no, let's stop. Let's think about what we need to do. And we thought about the listening piece in terms of communication and developing those relationships. But the first thing I did was start looking at TED Talks on listening. So there were some great conversations out there, presentations on listening, and some really clear points as to how to listen effectively, giving feedback, paraphrasing, all of those important things that we understand. But when we do it in the space that's intentional for a purpose, it makes the greatest impact. When we understand that listening is so important to the work, that's huge. I even just had a parent meeting the other day, and I apologized to a parent because I told her, I'm sorry, I was looking to answer your question, but I wasn't listening to you. I was too busy trying to get my point across and answer the question. And I said, I'm so sorry, I didn't listen to you, because she was getting frustrated and I was getting frustrated. And it was funny, but after I apologized and I said, I have to listen better, she really enjoyed that I said that to her. And we all have to catch ourselves in the process, because as we're listening, we're trying to figure out our response. We're trying to figure out how we're going to either answer a question or do whatever we need to do, because we're going to either be on the defensive or whatever the case may be. But we need to focus, and it's a challenge.
Thank you. Hannah, is there anything you'd like to add to this, either about listening or about facilitation in general?
Yeah, I would just add one thought that I've been reflecting on after you asked, Rebecca, which is the importance of modeling this all day long. So yes, facilitation in meetings, in communities of practice where that's the focus, and also in the way that I interact with every teacher in any moment with them and respond to something they bring up about a family member or a parent or a child with a question about what they were hearing and what degree of listening they brought to the table. And then just modeling it in every family meeting, anytime we have a student success team meeting, sitting down and starting with listening and starting with family voice and student voice, and letting everyone on the team see that that's a value that I bring as a leader, and that we're all trying to commit to and get better at as a whole school. And so just really committing to that modeling piece all day long.
I also want to draw our attention to the issue of networks and community engagement for leaders. We know that the role of leaders can be very isolating. You know, there's often only one or two administrators, for instance, at a school, and it can feel like a very isolating role. We heard some really interesting examples, both from the research and also from your experiences, about how you're strategically connecting yourself to other peers. So tell me, how do you know when the person is going to be a good mentor, or whether they'll probably be a good collaborator, or whether you'll probably have synergy and be able to support each other? How do you identify those things?
When I look at potential people that I can collaborate with, I'm looking at people that have the same ideas, not necessarily agree with everything that I say, but in terms of my passion for the work that we do around education and equity and getting to that space, and just those who have something that I can learn from in terms of either cultural experiences, socioeconomic experiences, or just anything that their background can help me understand different places and people, and just be able to become more aware, because the more we learn about differences and the people that we work with, the better we get at understanding and that empathy piece. So for me, it's all about, making those authentic connections and really connecting with people who have the same, a lot of the same beliefs and visions that you have, not necessarily all the same practices, but, want the best for our communities.
And I would add to that I've been sort of shamelessly asking for help from the very beginning of this role. And I've very quickly started to see who is willing to help, and whose help was great. So asked a lot of questions, and to a lot of people I got no response, right? I would send a question about chronic absenteeism struggle with a family that I was really trying to figure out how to work with this family and help them get through the challenge that they were going through. And I told several people at the district about it and asked for their opinion and their support. And I heard back from one person, and I could see that this was the person who was taking the extra time of their day to respond to the new school leader's question about a family in need. And then the next time I had a similar challenge, I reached out to that person again, and I started to see the trends of who was really willing to go out of their way to support those of us in the schools. And so that happened with enough people over the first year that by the end of my first year in leadership, I could see who in the district were my allies in terms of being ready to help, being really committed to our students, and also just excited to support a new leader in particular. So just like putting myself out there, putting the questions out there, being willing to ask for help, and then picking up on the cues that I was getting from people that they were prepared to be on a team with us at the schools.
I want to bring it back to.
And I think,
go ahead. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to add something that Hannah made me think about, is in terms of the networking, and this is an equity issue, is that many times our communities may not be represented at the district level, culturally, economically, or in many different facets, and it can be difficult to form those networks when you are not part of that system, when you're not part of that core group. So it really becomes reaching out and creating that for yourself, and being able to connect with people, once again, who are in other levels and higher levels. And that's why it's important for us to be represented. Representation does matter. It's not just about representation, but it's about having people in those high level positions that understand, once again, community, culture, economic, all the pieces that go into this work.
So thank you for that. I want to bring it back to something that that Dr. Murata talked about in her research and see if we can close this section with tying something together, which is around her comment that another participant made about the community of practice being grassroots, that it wasn't driven by the district's agenda. And I'm not saying that districts shouldn't have meetings and agendas. I think that that's absolutely required. More to the point is I'm hoping to get a little bit more elaboration from Dr. Murata and then some responses from Hannah and Abelardo about exactly what that means and why that is so important, this idea of a grassroots effort.
Well, thank you for the question. I wonder that myself too, because although that came up in so many school leaders talks, I don't, because the district was addressing school reopening issues, and so the topics were similar, but the school leaders somehow felt that when they were over there, it was their discussion was guided by a district's agenda, right? So I was not there. I could not tell why that was so vastly different, but that showed up over and over again in their talk too. Or it could be because they've had such contentious relationship with the district at point that whenever the PD opportunities come from the district, they may not want to participate, but somehow 21 CSLA, although it's framed similarly, it was away from the district so that they felt the freedom to share what they wanted to share. But that's a question I had too, actually. If Hannah and Abelardo has some insight, I would love to hear.
And I'll let you go first. I jumped in last time.
Okay, thanks. I think about this a lot too, because I know all teachers feel the same way. And I'm not so far from the classroom. And I felt that way, that when I participated in lesson study and we chose the focus, it was the most valuable professional development experience. And the grassroots piece, I think, is connected to human nature, that when you're a part of a group that comes up with a problem to solve, and it doesn't come from outside and it doesn't come from up top, the drive that it creates in you is different. And I know that our teachers, we actually had a similar community of practice professional development cycle this year, and it was by far the most valuable experience, the teachers. And they all said, this was so much better than anything else we did. And it's just night and day for someone who's participating. And I think it's completely parallel for school leaders. When you get to come to a group and say, what is at the forefront of our work right now? What do we all want to do? And no one else is directing that, but you who are in the work and know what is at the top of your mind and central to your heart. It's just always going to be way better than something that was required. And the only professional development experiences that are really lasting in my mind for me as a teacher are the grassroots ones. And so I can only predict that that will be the same for me as a school leader. And I think there's probably, if we had a psychology professor here, I would want to know like truly what, I think there's a lot of layers to it around human nature and what we're bringing to the table in terms of why we see there more value in that experience. And there's, I'm sure, a lot more to pick apart there, but I know that to me, it's exactly the same as what everyone's written about teacher learning. And I know, Aki, having come from the lesson study background, it's a very natural jump for you. And so I'm sure you have much more to say about that. But I know that when our teachers feel that way. I completely understand, because I feel the exact same way as a school leader in meetings that are being required of me versus meetings where I get to be a part of a conversation that feels more natural and true to our work.
Maybe being required is the key phrase there, maybe. So, but then for school leaders' case, they were required, but they ended up not going though. So that's an interesting one, right? Like a parallel time, the same time we were offering this community of practice, they had another community of practice, a PLC, through the district. And it's not only one principal, there are several of them say, well, we didn't go there, but we came here. Or they kind of saw each other and say, ha, 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 we are here. Like we didn't go the Monday one, but we are here together. So that kind of became like a internal understanding that they don't want to go there, but they want to come here. But then maybe it was required but 21 CSLA was option. But Hannah, you talked about this, how 3:30 comes and you just wonder, like, should I go? Should I not go? This is a really long day, and then you click. So that's a decision-making point too, because you guys are so busy, so crazy busy.
Part of it is understanding the directive and the non-negotiables, and then working with your school community around how do we make it really applicable to our own school and our community. So we look at, when we're given, I come to the staff or leadership meeting and I say, these are the things we must do, but let's talk about how this is going to work for our school. How can we make it really effective, run smoothly, make sure it's a safe process, make sure that it's something that we can all understand. So it is a balance of doing what you need to do, but also making it work for your school community.
Well, I hope that everyone will join me in this webinar to thank our leaders. And I'm going to invite Dr. Murata to give a few closing remarks at the end of this webinar, please.
Yeah, I have to unmute myself. Thank you. Coming in here, I knew I will, of course, this was opportunity to share about my research, but I knew I was going to learn more, and I'm really happy that I learned so much by listening to Hannah and Abelardo, as well as your questions, Rebecca, that came from the audience, as well as yourself too, right? So, what I heard from, Hannah and Abelardo said this. Hannah said, not doing it alone is important. And Abelardo's point was, doing with people who understand what equity is. And I appreciate that, because he's been doing this work for decades. And so he talked about the same beliefs and commitment, and the value of collaborative reflection, that again, like not only you are thinking this through by yourself, but it's collaboratively. What do you think about this? What do you want to do about this? That's something I heard from my principals too. And also he said that the find the people with similar beliefs, but not necessarily same practices. And I thought that was a very powerful point, that because if you have similar beliefs and different practices, there's more to learn from each other that way, right? So I thought that was amazing thing, that I have to think more about it. But so Hannah said, she's non-shamingly asking for help. And I understand that this may be a counter-cultural move for school leaders to say, I need help, because in a broader society, school leaders are just shown as what, or illustrated or presented as superheroes. They can make amazing decisions, and they can just, you know, solve the problems, and they can save the community, but they are humans too. And the wide school leaders of whom I get to work with, they remind me the emphasis on collaboration, and they can do so much more when they have each other. And also I want to say somehow the pandemic made it visible too, because we were also helpless, all of us. And I mean, especially that community of practice, I saw that they had to have each other to make plans for reopening. So that was a good learning experience for me. So yes, like emphasis of collaboration and supporting school leaders through creating meaningful network will be a big agenda in my future. So thank you for sharing today. Thank you for helping me learn. I really appreciate your energy, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'll offer a few closing remarks also as the director of 21 CSLA. I was listening to them and thinking, here are leaders who are actively participating in our offerings. What can we learn from them as a collective that is trying to support transformational leadership? So I'll leave us with a few thoughts, really more provocative thoughts for future discussion inside our 21 CSLA group. And it includes the idea of career ladder. I was really struck by the fact that Hannah was at the beginning of her career. Abelardo is a seasoned administrator, and yet both of them sought out the support of a community of practice, perhaps with slightly different motivations, but they both benefited from it. And how even the descriptions of how people in different points of the career ladder could help each other was really interesting in the idea of a community of practice. So I really want to think about that more, about how phases of the career may have benefits in integrated formats, and maybe also in sometimes in more affinity formats. Another piece I've been thinking about is this issue of individualization. Abelardo really challenges his community to think about equity in the form of individual needs or individual group needs, not equal treatment. And I think his challenge to me personally and to 21 CSLA is, how does 21 CSLA see leaders as individuals and individual groups and identify those needs and try to address them, as opposed to addressing things from a whole group format? And how is that connected to our ideas about equity and what it means to provide equity-centered professional learning? Another piece I'm walking away with is something that Marty just wrote about in the chat, which is the underlying conditions, the conditions that have to be at play in these communities of practice to really be able to support equity leaders. And some of them were named, like active listening. I think there were others that weren't named, and Marty started naming some of them in the chat, like issues of trust. There are a lot of deep issues of trust that came about that I think we should really investigate more in terms of how facilitators engender trust and cultivate trust so that we can support leaders to find others that they want to learn from. Finally, I'll just say that I was really struck by this idea of the learning leader. I heard it as a part of these two transformational leaders, and also in the comments you shared in your research presentation. Each of these leaders went into the community of practice with a learner's stance. They went in seeking information or wanting to learn from others. And I'm thinking about that as a precondition. How and when do leaders get to learn? So I'm looking forward ultimately, Aki, to you doing many more webinars where we can continue to learn about how we support the needs of Leaders for Equity. And I thank you so much for all of your work. Please join me, participants, in thanking Senior Research Fellow Dr. Aki Murata for her contributions to our collective work. Before we go, I just want to share a session feedback form. We've done 8 of these webinars and we're continuing to improve our practice. So please give us some feedback so that we can continue to improve and meet your needs. And finally, 21 CSLA is sponsoring many public events that are open and free of charge to equity leaders across California, including 2 events, one at the American Educational Research Association conference this Saturday, and also a Leading for Equity in Universal Transitional Kindergarten community of practice that's happening actually at the statewide level. So network participants are getting to meet others around the state who are taking on the challenge of implementing universal transitional kindergarten. Thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedules during this hectic time of year. We're so appreciative for your support and participation. And until next time, please take good care and stay healthy and well.